What actually builds a truly just society? I mean, is it the laws we write, the economic systems we put in place, or is it something a whole lot deeper? Think about it like a massive, intricate building. If you were the architect, what kind of foundation would you need to pour to make sure the whole thing just doesn't collapse under the weight of, well, human flaw? Today, we're going to explore a 1,400-year-old architectural blueprint for society that attempts to answer that exact question.
Welcome to The Explainer. Look, if you're here, you probably want to bypass the noise and get straight to the structural logic of these complex ideas, right? Well, you are in the perfect place. Our goal today is to examine the holistic worldview of Islam, drawing directly from the academic and theological sources. We're going to look at this faith system literally like a building. We'll start at the bottom with its ethical foundation, move our way up through the structural pillars of daily practice, and finally step inside to see how it approaches domestic social paradigms, especially this really fascinating concept of equity.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our blueprint for today. We're starting with the foundations of Islamic ethics, then building the pillars of worship, looking at variations in those pillars, stepping into the paradigm of equity, and finally, balancing rights and responsibilities.
Starting with Section 1, Foundations of Islamic Ethics. To build literally anything that lasts, you've got to first pour a rock-solid foundation. And in this blueprint, that bedrock is beautifully captured in the concept of karamat al-insan. Now, in Islamic ethics, human dignity isn't just some social contract. It's not a privilege handed out by governments, and you definitely don't earn it by accumulating wealth or status. Actually, it's an inherent divine mandate. Just by virtue of breathing, of being human, every single person possesses equal worth. The sources we're looking at are super clear on this. It completely rejects any form of dehumanization or discrimination based on race, gender, or class. No exceptions.
To really anchor this foundation, let's look at this primary source quote from the Quran, chapter 17, verse 70. It boldly declares that the children of Adam, which means all of humanity, by the way, have been honored. What does this tell us? It tells us that in Islam, ethics, known as akhlaq, and equality before the divine are completely inseparable from the faith itself. Behaving morally and recognizing the dignity of the person sitting next to you isn't just polite social convention, it's literally an act of worship, and it's one that a person is ultimately accountable for.
Moving up to Section 2, the pillars of worship.
All right, so the ethical foundation is poured. Now we can raise the walls. For the majority of Muslims, specifically within Sunni Islam, this structure is held up by the 5 pillars. You've got the Shahada, which is the core declaration of faith. Then there's Salah, the physical prayers performed 5 times a day facing Mecca. We have Zakat, which is mandatory almsgiving, Psalm, the month of fasting, and finally the Hajj, that massive lifetime pilgrimage to Mecca. Notice how these pillars create this distinct rhythm? There's a daily rhythm with prayer, an annual rhythm with fasting and charity, and a once-in-a-lifetime rhythm with the pilgrimage. It keeps that foundation of faith constantly active, constantly engaged.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the specific number behind that third pillar, zakat, 2.5%. We're not just talking about dropping your spare change in a collection bin here. Islamic sources dictate that believers have to calculate and deduct about 2.5% of their accumulated wealth. And that's not just your income, that's stagnant wealth, and it's redistributed directly to the poor, to debtors, and to travelers. It's this absolutely fascinating mechanism that connects ancient religious law straight to our very modern universal desire for economic justice. By making charity a mandatory structural pillar, the architecture of the faith is actively working to prevent people from just hoarding wealth and to eliminate severe social inequality.
The fourth pillar, Psalm, or fasting during the month of Ramadan, does something really similar, but it operates on a totally psychological level. By physically abstaining from food and drink from dawn until dusk, believers are viscerally reminded of their own human fragility. I mean, your stomach is growling, you're thirsty. It's a physical act that directly reinforces that foundation of karamat al-insan, that inherent human dignity we talked about earlier. It forces a shared experience of hunger, and that builds an incredibly powerful universal empathy for folks who are less fortunate, all while pushing you to reflect, seek forgiveness, and basically recharge your moral character.
All right, Section 3, Variations in the Pillars.
Of course, in any massive architectural tradition, different builders are going to customize the blueprint a bit, right? While Sunni Islam focuses on the 5 pillars we just discussed, Shia denominations have their own classifications. For instance, 12-verse Shia Islam identifies foundational beliefs and pairs them with 10 ancillaries of the faith. This still includes zakat, but it also adds something called khums, which is a 20% annual tax on surplus wealth that goes to religious leaders and the needy.
On the other hand, Ismaili Shia Islam outlines 7 pillars, incorporating walaya, which is all about deep love, devotion, and guardianship to God and the imams. But the absolutely crucial thing to understand here is that while the classifications and some specific practices vary from group to group, the overarching goal, structuring a life of worship, charity, and ethical discipline, remains exactly the same across the board.
On to Section 4, the paradigm of equity.
Okay, so we've laid the ethical foundation, we've erected the pillars. Now let's actually step inside the building to examine the life lived within it. When we analyze gender roles in Islam, academic sources really urge us to shift our lens. Modern Western conversations almost always frame gender rights as this competition for absolute equality, meaning absolute sameness in every single role and function. However, the Islamic paradigm operates on a framework of equity, or divine balance. Instead of enforcing strict sameness, the sources outline this incredibly sophisticated system of reciprocal rights and duties. It views men and women as deeply complementary partners. Fairness here is achieved through a balanced distribution of unique, intersecting responsibilities. It's like a giant puzzle where different pieces fit together perfectly.
But before we get into the differences in those roles, we absolutely have to establish the parity of the soul. Let this source text from the Quran speak for itself. It explicitly promises divine reward and a good life to whoever does righteousness, whether male or female. Theologically, Islam assigns the exact same spiritual responsibility and moral accountability to both sexes. There is absolutely no concept here that one gender is somehow spiritually superior or inherently more flawed than the other. They are on equal footing.
And that spiritual parity, it historically translated into some pretty significant real-world rights, often totally subverting the assumptions we make today. Take a look at the number 88 on your screen. That represents the minimum number of distinct individual scholars, both male and female, who were personally instructed by Aisha, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad. Think about that for a second. In an era 1400 years ago, she was an absolute powerhouse of intellect and jurisprudence, narrating over 2,200 ahadith. This powerfully showcases that the right to education in Islam is simply not gendered. In fact, the Prophet himself mandated that acquiring knowledge is obligatory for every single Muslim, man or woman, no exceptions.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the paradigm of equity operates in economic and marital terms too. Let's look at the concept of the mahr, or dower. Now, unlike a dowry that gets paid by the bride's family, the mahr is a mandatory financial settlement paid by the groom directly to the bride when they get married. The academic sources point out something lovely here. The Arabic root for this concept is related to the word for honey. It's designed to be a gift of affection, unity, and respect. It is definitely not a purchase price. More importantly, it establishes the woman's immediate financial independence from day one, because that wealth belongs solely to her, to invest, save, or spend however she sees fit.
Finally, Section 5, Rights and Responsibilities.
So how does the Islamic model actually balance individual agency with the necessary stability of society? Well, we can see that reciprocal balance directly in the rights and duties. On the right side, the Islamic framework historically granted women the right to independent wealth and inheritance, the right to initiate a khula divorce, the right to political participation and voting, and, as we saw, the right to education. But the paradigm of equity dictates that these rights are balanced by profound moral responsibilities. The sources detail that while the man bears the strict legal and financial burden of providing for the family, the woman's primary moral responsibility anchors the home. She's viewed as the guardian of the household's stability and the primary architect of the children's physical and spiritual upbringing. It's a system that attempts to ensure the domestic institution, which is really the ultimate building block of any society, is heavily guarded and nurtured rather than being neglected in a pursuit of absolute sameness.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought. We've just looked at an architecture of faith that starts with inherent human dignity, builds upward with these disciplined pillars of daily worship and charity, and houses a social paradigm that values complementary balance over identical roles. So as you look around at our modern world today, a world that is often intensely focused on absolute sameness, what can we actually learn from this 1400-year-old paradigm of reciprocal equity? Does true justice mean everyone doing the exact same thing? Or does it mean a harmonious balance of distinct, deeply respected contributions? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Take this blueprint, reflect on it, and keep exploring.